going to tell you a little story about where I come from, how I got into alternative finance. And afterwards, more towards the end of the presentation, I will get to the more theoretical part and sum up things we've learned. So, I always go back to 2008. And that's when we all remember the crisis that we are still in today began. And it was a credit crisis. Very simple. Banks didn't lend out money anymore, so enterprises couldn't acquire the funds anymore to do the activities they wanted to do. And in 2008, things were really fantastic. We've seen very large economic highs, and we've seen a flourishing innovation culture, especially in the IT scene. And some examples of that are, for instance, this picture of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. Not real, obviously, but those are examples of startup companies, Apple, Microsoft, founded in the 80s, growing large in the 90s. And these entrepreneurs started off with a small idea. They were dropouts, and they could count on a limited number of individuals that would give them a blank check. For instance, Apple and Google got blank checks in the beginning by business angels amounting up to $100,000. Those investors would say to the founders, do with the money as you like, because your idea is so great, we can start. There was an abundance of finance to start a new startup company. And after the credit crisis, we all know that this is a big problem. Who of you are entrepreneurs? They see. It has probably become a significant part of your attention in running a company. It's how you finance new investments, right? So let's have a look at how startups have funded themselves ever since. And then I have this picture of the legendary Baron von Munchausen. Who knows him? And this guy was a big storyteller. And one of the big stories, for instance, is that he always went to war, and then he said, I sat on a cannonball and I flew over the enemy lines, and that's how I infiltrated into the enemy camp. And this is a story of himself making another big story, how he pulled himself out of a swamp. And actually, the legend goes that he did that by pulling the straps of his boots. And the term of bootstrapping comes from that. And bootstrapping has become one of the most important ways for startup companies to finance themselves after the credit crisis. Bill Gates and Steve Jobs didn't have to bootstrap themselves, but modern companies use bootstrapping, and bootstrapping actually takes practice in a way as taking a lot of credit card subscriptions, filling them all to the top, and then just making enough revenue to be able to pay it. So they actually, bootstrapping is taking money wherever it is, not even really deserving it, and that way funding your company. And this is really a problem, because big investments are not possible anymore. We are living on short-term debt. And there needs to be a solution to that. And then it has been a very fruitful time for business angels. Because this is a scene from a TV show called Dragon's Den, that's right. And where here you see 5 business angels, and that's how a lot of startups have been funded recently. These business angels, they have, say, like 50,000 euros. And they can spend it to any of 10 pitching companies. And maybe of 10, 1 or 2 go home with those 50,000 euros to start their plan. But that's not a big solution to the problem we have, because that's only for the happy few. And the problem with business angels is they only invest with maximum upward potential. Whereas, if you look at society, on average 99% of the companies we use on a daily basis do not have maximum upside potential. So that's a problem. So we figured back in 2009 what if we could turn normal people that use normal companies into these business angels? And these business angels say, maybe we all have 50,000 euros to spend and to take risks with. But maybe those people, involved people, modern, new generation, people that are interested, people that know about new developments in society, people like those from a stock photo. And we thought there could be a model to that. And we see a few things that have happened in the past 5 years that are very interesting for new finance models. Namely, we have social media. Who doesn't have a social media account? Is it one person, two persons? Whoa, that's really old-fashioned. Social media offers access to a huge audience. If you have anything to say, and if anyone is interested in this subject, you can really find them very, very easy. That's a strength, because entrepreneurs can use that to get attention for their cause. They can actually say, I need money to execute my plan. And maybe those people that are interested are willing to support them. We see other things happening. Individuals want to make a difference. We see a lot of individuals with significant private health that don't want to invest in stocks, that don't want to invest in long-lasting bonds, but that want to invest in financial products that make a difference. For instance, you see people and they can invest on the stock exchange. For instance, in the Netherlands market, maybe they would buy shares in Philips or Shell. But the disadvantage with Philips or Shell is you can't talk to the boss. You don't know whether it will be higher valued or lower valued at the end of the year. And you don't understand where your specific money is going into. That's a big problem. There's a lot of people that are looking into far more interesting investments. And the alternative finance instruments use these developments and tap into that. So what we did in 2008 and 9, we gathered a group of people to start to think about a solution. And we founded one of the first crowdfunding companies in the Netherlands. And crowdfunding, for instance, we have already seen an example of crowdfunding in Kickstarter earlier today. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to make it possible for people not to donate money, but to invest money. But then not with large amounts, but for instance to invest 20 euros, and then, because there are entrepreneurs after all, if there is a gain on this investment, let everyone profit on that. Even if it's only €1 after a couple of years. That's the interesting thing. So we actually made it to the front page of the Dutch Financial Times in 2010. It was really great. And the first entrepreneur we funded in 2010 was a small barista company. I'll get back to that later. But then came the problems, because this appeared to be very, very complex. We managed to create an infrastructure that made investments possible, but the Dutch legal framework wouldn't allow it. So this is actually a real picture of the paperwork we had to submit to the National Bank and to the Authority of Financial Markets. It took us a couple of years, and we hired a Amsterdam, South Axis-based law firm to do this for us. But 75,000 euros, and a year later, they didn't succeed. So we went to talk with the Authority of Financial Markets ourselves, and we found a way to actually get a permit, and we did it ourselves actually. And in a couple of months, we made it. It's very interesting, because nothing bad about the Amsterdam law firms, because it was a very, very prestigious law firms, but they tried to do the same trick with our company as that they do with the listed companies. So that was a little bit of a problem. We were so new that we really needed people to change their paradigms, even in the professional services they were in. So, but we also had that in the IT world, by the way. I'll get back to that later. But it was really a big problem. And when we were in business for 3 years, we had funded a lot of companies. but it was very hard to make the model profitable. So you can see this real picture, lots of fights, lots of stress, things like that. But then in 2012, something happened. And this is a picture of, who knows it? It's the Occupy movement. And I bet that you haven't heard about the Occupy movement for at least a year, is that right? Yeah. But you still know very well what they stand for. And we all know that actually what they stand for is in the back of our heads right now. Those are the people that say, I don't want to buy those shares in the Shell or the Philips company, but they want to see their money go to a cause where it makes a difference in society and where they can understand it. They say, I don't want to give my money to a banker and to a fund manager and make them do their big trick, but I want to give my money to invest into local bakery and buy bread and understand that it's spent in an oven that bakes my bread. And that is a big change. Simultaneously, and those are people, the Dutch people know who these people are. Simultaneously, the large banks in the Netherlands actually said, dear SMEs, we can't help you anymore. And that's not due to banks. It's a funny picture, especially when I show it to bankers. But it's not due to the banks. It's due to the regulation framework, which actually makes it practically impossible for banks to make a profit on loans, money they lend out to SMEs in sums smaller than about 250,000 euros. That's really extreme, because if you sum it up in euros, these loans maybe make up about 40% of the total amount of capital in loans. But if you name it in numbers of SMEs that can't be financed anymore, it's 99%. So as a banker, you would say, okay, no problem, weet je. We lose 40%, no problem. Some small players will go away, we'll go down a little. But actually in what we call street view, in like places like this where we are today, they don't attract loans of 250,000 euros. They attract loans of like 10, 20,000 euros. Wouldn't be able to exist anymore. The baker you go to wouldn't be able to exist anymore. The web shop where you buy your stuff wouldn't be able to exist anymore. This is really, really a big problem, even though in euros it's not such a large problem. And we have this problem until today. We haven't been able to solve it since 2012. And really, and I'll get back to that later in the theoretical part, this is a problem we can't solve. Because regulation and due diligence and securitization has made it impossible to make any money on setting out small sums, because the risk assessment will always cost more than the money that can be made by acquiring the interest. So we see two things happening. We see this change of thought in society, and we see this change in the way institutional world works. So there's a big paradigm shift. And this paradigm shift is the sole source of alternative finance models, and there are many of them. I'll get back to that later. So people will not set their savings out in managed accounts anymore. They will do right now, but if you look into their hearts, and if they would be able to determine on what causes the money would be spent, they wouldn't do it anymore. So it's the end of bankers and fund managers that take decisions on other people's money. This actually has the effect that instead of pooling money and doing investments in large ticket sizes, money will not be pooled anymore, and there will be a lot of small deals that have to be made. This is a desire, this is not practice yet, because it can be arranged that easily. But you see a notice from large ticket size, small amount of deals, moves into small ticket size, large amount of deals. And that's actually the exact opposite of what institutionalization has been working towards, especially in the financial sector. Because look at all financial institutions. All they have been doing is repositioning and taking larger and larger and larger deals, which is efficient, because if you reduce the number of deals, you will reduce the number of actions for making a deal, which makes you can make more money on a deal. So this is counterproductive action. If you look at the behavior of people and the way people think, you also see that it's not about getting the maximum rate of return on your savings and on your money anymore. It's about getting a high return on your money, or at least an acceptable return on your money, but also knowing that your money is not going into weapons, that your money is not going into oil, for instance, bad things, unsustainable things, and more we are moving towards knowing that our money is actually being invested into purposes that we can understand, that we can touch, that we can taste, that we can feel. So, basically speaking, for SME finance, we shouldn't look into this world anymore. There's nothing bad about this world, but regulation, Basel III, CRD4 for the ones that are well informed, makes that practically impossible. We have to look at finance models that are here, in the streets. Because in this picture, maybe there are 20 enterprises that can't be financed anymore by the classical institutions that financed them a couple of years ago. And this is this barista company that we financed in 2010. It's the world's first investment crowd-funded company. And they actually acquired 15,000 euros from 60 investors to buy coffee machines. And the idea is, if I can buy coffee machines, I can not only rent out my baristas, but I can rent them out with a machine. So it's an interesting investment. But the bank said, okay, yeah, well, we start giving out loans at 50,000 euros. So it's too small for us. It was no problem. So we thought, let's build a crowdfunding campaign around that. And what actually is interesting about this guy is he's a barista. That's logical, because that's also why he's raising money. But because he's a barista, that means that he's meeting hundreds of people every day that enjoy his product. And in the process of enjoying this product, he could actually interest them to make an investment. And there were people that were willing to buy a cup of coffee and to invest 10 euros or 50 euros or 100 euros because they could taste his product and because they could understand why he needed more of those machines to make that delicious cup of coffee. And it took him a week to get those 15,000 euros. And the interest rate he paid on that over 3 years was 15%, so that's 5% a year. And it has been paid back already. And that was a very successful crowdfunding campaign. But of course, we didn't only fund baristas, we went further. This is the first crowd-funded bar. And it's in Amsterdam. It's in the Nederstraatjes district. Perhaps some people know it. And it's a typical district because it has those typical Amsterdam bars with local singers and with, But those guys said, but those guys actually said, I want something different in that region. Because it's a very interesting region, and a lot of people go there, but I want a Hemingway-style jazz bar. One you should be ashamed if you're not wearing a suit. One where you drink whiskey and smoke a cigar, so they wanted to do that. And actually, there were about 100 people that were near this location that also wanted such a bar. And it took us about a month to collect 50,000 euros in this crowdfunding campaign to allow this guy to rent the property and to actually build in there the facilities needed to make this bar possible. And the funny thing is, because I'm very proud, so this happened in 2011, and when we funded them, I actually called the guy and I said, I'm coming to visit you soon. And then he said, you have to call in advance. I said, why? He said, because the bar is always full. And I called him in advance and I went there and the bar was full. And the funny thing was, the bar was full with its own investors. And there was an investor there. This is a story that the bartender told me. There was an investor there, and he didn't even live in the Netherlands. He lived in The Hague, and he was an expat. And every Thursday evening, he came to Amsterdam with his expat friends, and he said to his expat friends, "This is my bar." And this guy actually invested 125 euros, doesn't have any ownership. It's just a high yield, high risk. No, it's not high yield, it's high risk bond. But that's actually great for the entrepreneur, because maybe he only invested 125 euros, but he and his friends spent hundreds of euros every week in this bar. So the entrepreneur didn't only attract finance, he also attracted turnover. He attracted a fan base. And the investor, he didn't just invest and make an interesting interest, he actually also has a big gimmick he can show off with. So there are many, many motivations that come together in this model of alternative finance, which is investment crowdfunding. So we did some more. I'll show you some more. This is a office building. It's an alternative office building in an old municipality bus shed. It became a creative office space in Utrecht. It's one of the most well-known creative office spaces in the Netherlands. It's called Vechtclub XL. And this was actually crowdfunded by starting a crowdfunding campaign. And by the end of the crowdfunding campaign, out of all the investors, the company was rented out to companies that wanted to be in the building. It's very interesting because normally when you finance a construction project, you do the financing and then you try to get it rented out for about 70% or so, and then the deal is made. But these guys actually were able to acquire the money to make the deal, but also get all the renters to make it an operating company. It's really, really interesting. This is a fish breed pool, which is in the cooling tank of a paper mill. And the funny thing is, there's a paper mill which is at the Rhine River here in the Netherlands, and they have a lot of waste heat, and they put the waste heat out in the cooling tank. And the interesting is, you can't breed fish in the Netherlands because the climate is too cold, but when you put them in the hot water of the cooling tank, you can breed fish. And then the fish urinate in the tank, and that can be used to clean the water for making paper. That sounds funny, but it's really true. But it's also very, very risky. There's no bank who wanted to get involved in that, because if the fish die of the first bred, the company goes bankrupt, all the money is gone, and banks are not made for high-risk investments like that. But there were a lot of people that wanted to invest in sustainability, that wanted to invest in Dutch fish, that were very interested in that. And among all those investors were restaurants, were cooks, were private individuals who actually wanted to cook that fish and eat it and talk about it on birthdays and promote it. So that made this a very successful company, and I can go on forever, because this is a innovative startup that actually gives presents. You can order presents on a website, but the presents are not products but services from people. So you can actually book a yoga teacher, or you can actually book a piano teacher, or a birding tour, or whatever. Now, very interesting. I won't get too much in the details of all those companies. This is the biggest crowdfunding success in the Netherlands. It's also a company that we funded. It's an insurance company. It's a health insurance company. It recently, a week ago, acquired a license from the National Bank to actually start. But it was founded by hundreds of people that invested the first 800,000 risk-bearing euros to make this possible. It's really, really interesting. They are all the owner of the company, and it was also the purpose of the company, because they make better insurances if their clients are their owners, which leads to better claim behavior. Yogurt Barn is a type of yogurt snack bar. It's a chain. It has already funded 2 locations. by crowdfunding, simply because the company has so much fans, and those fans eat the yogurt, go on, right? You have a restaurant in a tram, I could go on forever. So we shouldn't be looking at the old world for financing SMEs anymore. But the interesting thing is we also shouldn't be looking at those stock photo people that are very, very interested, because we learned that it's not about interest, people who have a genuine interest in what's new. It's for everyone. It's also for these boring bakers, because it's their client. It's their clients that actually finance these companies. And this is a picture of our office. It's right in the middle there, and it's an old scrappy office building, of which the carpet has holes in it. And the funny thing is, entrepreneurs come to our office through all of the country to obtain their finance. And one day I was interviewed by a guy who was an editor for the accountancy magazine, and he said, when I go to the Rabobank headquarters, very fancy bank headquarters, I think I paid for the carpet. But when I come here, I'm sure I didn't. Okay, so that's a funny side step. Anyway, let's go to the theoretical part. The last few years have brought us some very, very interesting alternative finance models. And we've seen bootstrapping, that's actually the fallback scenario. We've seen crowdfunding, which in the Netherlands, but also in other European countries and even in the United States, has been evolving to a very important finance model for SMEs. 2 weeks ago, the first credit union credit in the Netherlands was given out, and maybe the people who are in the UK or now on something, they know about credit unions, but in the Netherlands, credit unions are really, really special. Credit unions are like bakers saving their money into a fund that's solely made for financing bakers. And the interesting thing about that is that bakers know a lot about bakers. So they can easily determine who is a good baker and not, and where they should invest their money. Really, really interesting. And the funny thing is, I can go on, matchmaking, factoring. All that these alternative finance models have in common are two things. They have an alternative capital source. For instance, in crowdfunding, the situation I explained, those are not pools of money, but simply the direct consumer money. But maybe even more important, they also have an alternative method of information acquisition. And the interesting thing about the second thing, the alternative source of information, is that this solves the problem that we have created with institutional finance. You remember I said that it was not profitable to give out loans smaller than 250,000 euros. And that's because the risk analysis costs about 10,000 euros, and that's the bank's profit. But the bakers in the credit union, or the clients in the crowdfunding campaign, they don't ask any money to do the credit analysis. However, they do determine for themselves whether they would go to the store, whether they would buy bread, and whether they would recommend it to other people. So it's a very, very natural way in which we determine if a company can be successful or not. And the funny thing is, because we have financed 120 companies using the method of crowdfunding, and about 20 of them already reached their full payback date, and we noticed that even if the companies go bad, the first thing the investors do is not to see if they could lay their hands on the entrepreneur's home or car or savings account. The first thing they would do is they would go into the store and buy more products. And in the end, all the entrepreneurs were able to pay the investment back to the investors. That's really interesting, because what's happening is that society is becoming more and more involved and feeling more and more responsible for local entrepreneurship. And that's where we have to get back to. Disadvantage is it's very complex. We have old laws, we have old regulators, and even though they are, especially in the Netherlands, I think, of very good will, it's very tough to project innovative models on such a highly regulated market as the financial market. So that's a big challenge. It's really a big challenge, and it's not solved with new law proposals. It's not solved with new regulations. It's just solved by experimenting and doing making small advances, and actually involving the regulators and the authorities in that. It's really interesting what's happening, because in the United States, for instance, there are crowdfunding laws being implemented, which is interesting to see, whereas in the Netherlands there is no crowdfunding regulation being implemented, but all the crowdfunding companies are actually formed legally to be classic investment companies, so that they can actually do the same activities. It's very old-fashioned, but it works great. We have, my company, Vroemen now itself, we have a permission that is comparable to a company like Robeco, for instance. A classic investment company. Nobody sees it, especially if you see this picture, you wouldn't think that you would be at Robeco. But that's the way that you can implement it. Oh. Actually ending the presentation accidentally. There we go again. So that's very tough, and that's very challenging, and this is really putting a slowdown on finance innovation. And one of the interesting things is, you can see it if you compare crowdfunding and credit unions. And crowdfunding has been a world of entrepreneurs that actually start doing, that actually take initiative, whereas credit unions have started out lobbying. And this has led to the first credit union credit only being given out a week ago, whereas the first crowdfunded entrepreneurs already were there in 2010. So it's really interesting. This is learning by doing. Actually, in the first years, we broke the law. And today, the financial authorities are grateful that they have a precedent of a company that broke the law in a controlled way. It's very interesting in how you could look at that. There are changing due diligence models. That's very interesting. Basically, two things are happening. One is to solve the problem of the unprofitable downside of the market. We can do a lot of data mining and try to model entrepreneurs. That's a new source of data. A lot of development is going into there, but it's not going very quick. Alternative source is the one I explained. Apply crowdsourcing. So get the knowledge where it is. Is this a good bakery? Ask it to the clients. And if the clients are willing to put in their money and risk losing it, it's probably a good bakery. The big challenge is, how can I measure an enterprise without spending a lot of money on it? So that's the future of social due diligence. Well, we deinstitutionalize due diligence models, credit rating models, and simply look at the things that count for the end user. Because that's the cheapest and most efficient way to apply a due diligence model. I already told you something about the unprofitable bottom of the market. Right now it's at about 250,000 euros, but CRD4 is being implemented. And this is so extreme that banks, if you borrow an amount of about 100,000 euros from a bank, the European Central Bank actually marks that amount as so risky that the bank will have to take an additional 100,000 euros and reserve it on their balance sheet to make it possible. So in fact you have to pay for twice the amount of money to make it possible. It's really extreme. We're going too far in that, and that movement will come back, but that will be in a couple of years already. The unprofitable bottom of the market is moving up. It's going up to 500,000 euros, I think. And for entrepreneurs, and this is my last recommendation, for entrepreneurs, I think it's very important to ask yourself, what do I need? Do I need capital? Do I need risk-bearing capital? Do I need a market? Can I perhaps combine that? What am I looking for? Am I looking to finance my company in a sustainable way, making it financially durable by putting in revenue, or am I simply only looking for money to buy that album? Those are very important things for entrepreneurs to ask themselves, and I really notice that a lot of entrepreneurs that don't ask themselves this question spend years and years of searching for the type of capital that could have simply found at the other side of the counter. That was my story. Thanks.